They came from very different parts of the world, very different cultures, but all shared a willingness to kill their own citizens. This is Absolute Power Week. Biographies look at dictators who took oppression to the extreme. Tonight, Nicolae Ceausescu, who terrorized Romania for a quarter century. Of all the criminals hidden by the Iron Curtain, he was the worst offender of all. On Christmas Day of 1989, Romanians received an unexpected gift. Their dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, and his wife were tried, convicted, and shot by a firing squad. During his years in power, Ceausescu had elevated himself to the status of a near god, living in marble palaces while his people suffered. Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife once again proved the accuracy of the famous observation made by Lord Acton: power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Nicolae Ceausescu, once revered throughout Romania and the West, he stole power by cunning and ruled by oppression.
Deci, avea el această
He had this ambition
ambiție
and this dream,
acest vis.
which he eventually made come true.
Avea vocația pentru
He had a vocation for despotism and tyranny. He was an absolute master.
Ceausescu was a tyrant politically, a disaster economically, but in foreign policy he had glitters of genius.
Ceausescu's tainted genius and his wife Elena's malign influence were finally extinguished by a hasty execution, the end of a misused life. Nicolae Ceausescu was born into a poor peasant family on the 26th of January 1918. When registering his latest son's name, his father was too drunk to remember that he already had another son named Nicolae, so now he had two. Ceausescu's illiterate mother, Alexandra, found it difficult to bring up her large family on the meager earnings she and her husband Andrutsa could prize from the soil of their tiny plot of land. And there was little other work in the village of Scornicești, where the Ceausescus lived. The village lay about 100 miles west of the Romanian capital, Bucharest, in a quiet, forgotten backwater. Scornicești was a village of peasants. Without a cart, an ox, and a plow, it was impossible to eke out a living from the land. Those who couldn't would die of hunger or move away to the cities. The Ceausescu's tiny house stood in the middle of their small grassy plot, where their one sheep would graze, providing milk for the whole family. There were only 2 rooms separated by a small hallway. In these cramped surroundings, Nicolae, his parents, and 9 brothers and sisters would have to eat, wash, and sleep. This impoverished background influenced the rest of Ceausescu's life. From an early age, his lifelong political beliefs were stirring in his head.
Ceausescu's communist ideals, I think, really derive, first of all, from his family background, a very poor family background. He lived in the village. His family had a very small income. His father seems to have worked only off and on, and because of that, he had great difficulty in supporting the 10 children.
Ceausescu's father drowned his sorrows in drink and had an inventive way of getting it for nothing.
Well, he drank sometimes. The pub was opposite the house. It was his neighbor's. He used to drink on credit. One day, when the owner was asleep, he went and destroyed the credit notes showing how much he owed.
Ceausescu's underemployed father would send him into the fields of Scornicești to graze the sheep with the other village children. They found the young Nicolae very much a loner, an odd, introverted boy.
He wasn't friends with anyone. When we used to cook corn, there were many children, but he would be on his own. He used to ask why should those pigs have palaces and others have nothing. He was very revolutionary, very aggressive. He was smart. His ideas were big ideas.
These ideas continued to take shape in the mind of this underfed, lonely boy, a mind that was clever, cunning, and bright. Although Ceausescu often went to the village school barefoot with borrowed books, he was always at the top of the class. But his formal schooling was skimpy. Later, his smart, devious mind would have to scheme and plot on a shallow academic background. Ceausescu's schooling came to an early end when he decided to abandon the poverty of rural Romania and look for a better life. In 1928, when he was only 10 years old, he left his family and moved to the capital, Bucharest. Bucharest was cosmopolitan and sophisticated, and the first city Ceausescu had ever seen. After a childhood in a remote village, he found it hard to adjust, hard to throw off his country customs. He managed to get a job as an apprentice shoemender, but he was never able to master the trade and never made any progress. Although as time went by, he gradually adopted the modes of dress of the big city, he never quite adapted to its ways.
From the psychological point of view, I think he was an unbalanced character from the beginning. And the reason that he was unbalanced is that he moved from one world to another, from the village, where he was out of place, to the town, which he could not adapt to.
Ceausescu's boss, the shoemaker, was an active member of the illegal Communist Party. Under his influence, Ceausescu attended its clandestine meetings and there found a substitute for friendship.
So joining this marginal movement was the solution he found. He found an answer for his inability to integrate himself in social life. And the answer was disassociation.
Ceausescu became an activist for the communist youth, spreading propaganda. In 1932, he was recruited into the Romanian Communist Party. He was just 14. He was soon in trouble with the police and exiled back to Scornicest under armed guard. But he now found life in the village dull. He was unable to indulge his new passion for left-wing activism. Ceausescu soon sneaked back to Bucharest to rejoin his new colleagues in the illegal Communist Party. He soon found more trouble.
Nicolae Ceausescu was very hot-tempered, very quick in a rage. As a young man, he often was involved in street brawls, was a kind of person who would shoot first and then think.
Ceausescu's illegal activities often took him to jail. Once he was given an extra 6 months for making offensive gestures to the judge, but his solitary nature isolated him from his fellow prisoners.
He didn't have many friends. He never did. From this point of view, he was an absolutely unique person, a man who never had a friend in his entire life.
Ceausescu treated the younger members of the party as inferiors, although he flattered and paid deference to the more senior ones, especially the future leader of communist Romania, Gheorghe Gheorghe Dej.
Dej had an obvious liking for him. Ceausescu was a boy from the country with a quick, daring mind. He had an obvious thirst for political knowledge, a visible appetite for power. I think his true political school was the prison.
Ceausescu had been in and out of prison for years. In one of his rare moments of freedom, he had fallen in love with the almost illiterate Elena Petrescu, his first and last girlfriend. One night at a contest at his local pub, he arranged at great cost to have his lover enthroned as Queen of the Ball.
Ceausescu și-a cheltuit ultimul bani.
Ceausescu spent all his money in order to buy as many tokens as possible to choose that girl, the Queen of the Ball.
Și-a ales-o regina balului.
He told her while they were dancing together, although he didn't know how to dance, Leano, I'm going to make you a real queen.
Am să te fac cu adevărat regină.
The Queen of the Ball and Ceausescu became inseparable. At last he had found an ally and a friend. In time, Elena would become much more. Ceausescu and Elena married as his star began to rise. The Communist Party had been illegal. Now, at the end of the Second World War, the Red Army poured into Romania. Waiting to welcome them into Bucharest was Ceausescu. With the Red Army's help, his communist colleagues were about to take over. The foundations had been laid for Nicolae Ceausescu's rise to power. The Second World War was over, and in 1946 the Communist Party governed Romania. At 28, Nicolae Ceausescu began to plot his rise through its ranks. But not everything was in his favor.
He had the complex of inferiority because of his physical defects. He was undersized and ugly. And on top of that, he was afflicted by a stammer. And it was a stammer, a very funny one, that made you laugh, and that infuriated him.
With great willpower, Ceausescu managed to control his stammer and continued his rise through the party. As political head of the army, he became General Ceausescu. As secretary to the Central Committee, he carefully controlled all its new blood. He made sure it would be faithful to Nicolae Ceausescu.
Tot ce a făcut până în 65.
Everything he did until 1965, he put bit by bit, brick by brick, to build a strong platform for himself.
Puternic. În toate județele,
in all the regions, he had his own people who were faithful to him because he appointed them.
Ceausescu's continual plotting and intrigues, though, had alienated his rivals. Even his mentor, Gheorghe Dej, was having second thoughts about this ruthless manipulator. But Dej was developing terminal throat cancer. By now, Ceausescu had almost every brick in place for his leadership bid.
He was endowed with an iron will. And his life shows that what he wanted, he got. In political manipulation, intrigue, intra-party struggle for power, he was a Machiavellian genius.
Nicolae Ceausescu, the uneducated peasant, was one step away from his goal. The final step came quickly. Gheorghe Dej died in 1965. Ceausescu canvassed himself as leader at the funeral. To the last minute, he worked deviously to eliminate any lingering opposition, to make sure that nothing could prevent him gaining power.
I would say that he used the methods of Cosa Nostra, working in secret, making promises to some of the leading members of a Politburo that they should propose him as secretary, another one would second the proposal. He arranged that everything should go smoothly in making sure that he will be next Secretary General. And he did that in great secrecy.
2 days after Dej's funeral, Ceausescu was proclaimed first secretary of the Communist Party and the country's leader. He was only 47. Romania looked forward to a new era with hope.
He gave the impression that he's more liberal. He promised to set free political prisoners. He was very concerned of the prestige of his predecessor, and he wanted to destroy it to make room for his personality.
Soon, Ceausescu got a chance to display his personality to the world. In August 1968, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress the liberal regime of Alexander Dubček. One of the key factors in Ceausescu's election as leader was that he was thought to be the man most likely to stand up to the Soviet Union. He did, and the downfall of Czechoslovakia became the high point of Ceausescu's early rule. He called a vast rally in Bucharest to condemn the Soviet invasion. It was a brave move.
Pătrunderea trupelor celor 5 țări socialiste în Ceoslovacia constituie o mare greșeală și o primejdie gravă pentru pacea în Europa, pentru soarta socialismului în lume.
His attitude in front of Russia was very strong for our independence. In 68, 70, Ceausescu deserves to be supported, to be helped, because his behavior in front of Russia was very, very strong.
The adulation he received left a great mark on Ceausescu. In fact, planted in Ceausescu's mind the importance of popularity, the importance of being a leader who was respected by his people, and I think it was then that the seeds of the cult of the personality were sown.
Ceausescu's instincts over Czechoslovakia had tapped into a streak of Romanian nationalism and Western opportunism. President Richard Nixon led a procession to pay homage to the man who had stood up to the Soviet Union. Ceausescu and Romania were on the world map.
It is the first visit of a President of the United States to Romania. Să trăiască pătănia romano-americană.
Se vorbește foarte mult de incultura lui, de...
We talk a lot about his lack of culture,
dacă vreți,
his ignorance,
ignoranța lui.
If you want to put it like that. But this man had a native intelligence, an extraordinary intuition, a fantastic gift for leadership. He knew how to dominate and create events. He is a leader who did much for the prestige of Romania in the world.
But Ceausescu's popularity made him believe that his ambitions need have no limits. Few people stopped to question the darker, irrational side of him. Soon, they would have to. The character defects that Gheorghe Dej had noticed were becoming more and more evident. Ceausescu was a cheat. He was a passionate hunter, but a terrible shot. Gamekeepers killed the animals for him so that he could be hunting champion. He had begun to live in an unreal world where he couldn't bear to lose at anything.
Eu jucam tenis.
I used to play tennis, and he had never touched a tennis racket before. So I went to a court and knocked a few easy balls to him. After 10 minutes, he told me, "Okay, enough of this. Let's play seriously. I'm going to beat you. How could he possibly beat me when it was his first time on a court? But that's how he was.
Up to now, Elena and the Ceausescu's 3 children had remained in the background, but his son Nicu was to be groomed as Ceausescu's heir. Positions of power and patronage were given to friends and family. A circle of flatterers buoyed up the Ceausescu ego. In time, they would begin to isolate him from reality. When they did, Elena would step in to take control. By 1971, Nicolae Ceausescu had been in power in Romania for 6 years of genuinely popular and relatively liberal rule. His trip to China and North Korea would change all that. Mao Zedong had almost complete control over his people. Kim Il-sung of North Korea had complete control. The entire country was a shrine to its absolute ruler. Ceausescu loved it. From now on, he would try to run Romania on the same lines. The doubts of Gheorghe Dej about Ceausescu were now surfacing.
Ceausescu, since that moment, started his dictator behavior. Dictatorship being from the highest level to the lowest possible.
As the influence of the Korean trip began to take hold, repression came in many forms. Firstly, Ceausescu began his own mini-cultural revolution. Long hair, miniskirts, and Western pop music were out. Attacks on intellectuals and decadent artists were in. The personality cult had begun, with paintings and sculptures ordered by the dozen to reflect the overblown, idealized image of both Ceausescu and his wife Elena, on whom he was coming to rely more and more. Ceausescu and his wife had been absent from a number of key moments in the fight against fascism, so now they started to rewrite history. At first, he and Elena were merely added as inserts to a photograph of a demonstration. Later, he had himself firmly planted in the crowd, rather amateurishly, looking in a different direction from everyone else. At the last attempt, Ceausescu's head was turned round, undeniable proof to the country that both he and Elena had attended the demonstration. Reality was manipulated at all levels. Banners were painted onto photographs to demonstrate public adulation for the great man. If either he or Elena missed a public appearance, their image was crudely stuck on afterwards. Photographs revealing Ceausescu's wrinkles were rejected. The ones released to the public showed a Ceausescu who never seemed to grow old.
So his picture was touched up until it looked better. They didn't look that good even when they were young. All wrinkles were removed with the help of spray and brush. There was a special spray which was used for the face, the same color as the photograph. It made it look uniform and removed absolutely all shadows and wrinkles from the face.
Ceausescu now ordered vast Oriental-style rallies to honor him. But the chosen one, the savior, and the genius of the Carpathians, as he liked to be called, was becoming paranoid and increasingly in fear of disease and contamination, even at meetings of the Politburo.
All the doors were sealed. All the curtains were drawn. No breath of wind was allowed. He was horrified by the cold. He didn't trust anybody. This man even used to take his own sheets with him because he was afraid others might be radioactive.
He was not mad all the time. Most of the time he was normal. It's a typical case of paranoia. when he was under heavy pressure, he would lose his normal functioning of brain and mind.
Ceausescu's bouts of paranoia meant that he increasingly relied on his wife. During the China trip, Elena had met Mao Zedong's wife, Madame Mao, and had found a woman with a political role of her own. Elena demanded and got one for herself.
Ceausescu really fell back on his wife for more and more advice. They sought solace in each other. They became more and more dependent on each other, and they involved less and less the other members of the Politburo in the major decisions that were taken both internally and externally.
But where Ceausescu was smart, the illiterate Elena was not. Her influence was a malign one, and one that grew and grew.
Madame Ceausescu was in charge for repression. She considered people like rats, not people, and in any moment ready to be killed.
The instrument of repression for Romania was Securitate, the secret police. Its network of spies and informers worked at every level of society. Securitate operated in a hidden world, reporting the most private activities of the Romanian people, compiling secret files, torturing, and bringing misery to millions.
Securitate was the most monstrous institution, having about 700,000 informers. In every enterprise, in every village, in every institution, in every school, in every faculty, there was at least one informer.
Despite the repression at home, in 1978 Ceausescu won his greatest prize, in his mind the most prestigious trip of all, the Queen at Buckingham Palace, arranged because the British government wanted to sell him some airplanes. The propaganda victory was invaluable. The greater the stature of his hosts, the greater his reflected glory, and the more his repressive policies in Romania would be overlooked. The visit would also help mask the awkward decisions Ceausescu would soon have to make at home. By the early 1980s, Ceausescu was coming to rely more and more on his wife Elena. A double-headed tyranny was now ruling Romania. Her profile was boosted by academic honors heaped upon her at home and abroad, but there was no justification for them.
I think Elena Ceausescu will go down in history as the biggest hoax in scientific activity. She made up a team of scientists, of chemists, who wrote books under her name. Her motto was, "You write, I sign."
Elena's influence was increasing at a time when Ceausescu's economic policies started running into trouble. He had built up a huge industrial capacity, based partly on a deal for cheap oil from Iran. After the fall of the Shah in 1979, the deal fell through. The resulting national debt was around $16 billion, and in 1980 he decided to pay it back at a stroke. Massive cutbacks followed.
Dacă vroia șeful întreprinderii,
if the director of a factory wanted, he could keep you working day and night. Students were working, school children were working, teachers were working, everyone was working, the army as well, and everyone was working for nothing, free.
Huge energy cuts meant few public transport services. Electricity was cut off without warning, trapping old people in elevators and cutting heat and light from babies in incubators. People froze to death in winter. Massive shortages were created at home, with people often standing in line all night for the little food available.
He was prepared to starve the Romanians. He asked the Minister of Health to write a diet program which eliminated meat from the diet of Romanians. He wanted to make us vegetarians.
Ceausescu and Elena lived in splendor in their Bucharest mansion while Romanians starved and froze. Throughout their reign, they built up a collection of over 80 houses, palaces, and lodges. From their luxurious surroundings, they now prepared a new decree, one designed to crush completely free speech, free writing, and free thought. The Great Romanian Typewriter Decree banned the owning of typewriters unless authorized by the militia. Owners must submit a sample of their typing to the authorities. Typewriters beyond repair must be handed in at a collection point, their keys destroyed. The next instrument of control was systematization, the wholesale destruction of villages and their way of life. Ceausescu wanted to pigeonhole every Romanian, a bid for total control.
He wanted to destroy every independent economic act in Romania. Even before Christmas, if you wanted to sacrifice a pig, you had to get the approval of the militia.
As systematization spread, people were forced out of their houses, losing the land from which they made their living. The heart of rural Romania was beginning to be destroyed. Blocks of landless apartments were built, but often not in time to rehouse the homeless peasants, whose way of life disappeared under concrete. Historic old Bucharest also stood in the way of systematization. To Ceausescu, people owning their homes represented a certain freedom and independence which he wanted to end. The greatest fear in Bucharest was the wave of Ceausescu's arm to condemn another few streets to dust. House owners had to sign forms requesting the demolition of their own houses and had to pay for it. A fifth of Bucharest disappeared. Thousands of homes were demolished unnecessarily and thousands of lives ruined. Apartment buildings into which Ceausescu could pack his subservient workers towered over what was left of old Bucharest.
In his mind, the highest type of civilization is apartment building. You have to live in an apartment building. That was his ideal type of social life.
I think the urban planning, the socialist urban planning, had as the main rationale behind it the idea of controlling people.
The culmination of the grand plan in Bucharest was the vast House of the People, one of the 3 biggest buildings in the world. The house, built for state functions, was a reflection of his inflated opinion of himself. As the house went up, the foundations of his rule were at last beginning to crumble. An open and critical letter, signed by 6 of his most powerful opponents, was published throughout Europe. This letter of 6 was the first chink in Nicolae Ceausescu's armor. Revolution was not far behind. By November 1989, the tide had turned against communism in Eastern Europe. The pent-up frustration of millions was symbolized by the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. The exception was Romania. At the annual Congress, Ceausescu and Elena tried to ignore what was happening across Europe. But the critical letter of 6, written by their most senior opponents, had revealed a vulnerability. Opposition was possible. The Ceausescus had surrounded themselves with sycophants and false prophets. Their reception of the Congress was deceiving. The twin dictators had only another month to live.
Ceausescu singur nu ar fi
Ceausescu by himself would not have developed into the megalomaniac he had become by the end, in 1989, if he hadn't been followed by a court of admirers and flatterers. They simply annihilated his sense of reality.
If the letter of 6 had opened a chink in the armor, in Timișoara and the west of the country, the floodgates were about to open. Pastor Laszlo Tokes had been criticizing the Ceausescus in subtly worded sermons, and in doing so, building up large congregations. When in mid-December 1989 his bishop tried to banish him, thousands of people surrounded his church in support. The revolution began here. On Ceausescu's orders, the army opened fire, and about 100 were killed, but rumors spread of 60,000 dead. When recently buried corpses in unmarked paupers' graves were dug up, the rumors of mass executions seemed to be confirmed. The revolution was now about to spread across the country. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu now had only 8 days to live. They were almost the last to realize it. Amazingly, Ceausescu left for a 3-day trip to Iran, leaving Elena in charge of Romania. Their advisors had told them that the riots of Timișoara had been quelled, that everything was back to normal. Nobody had dared tell them the truth. The revolution was starting at home, but Ceausescu was signing trade agreements with the Iranians. On the 21st of December, Ceausescu returned to Bucharest and called a vast rally. He had lost touch with reality and believed that by one personal appearance he could turn the clock back. A last-minute offer to increase pensions by a few pennies did nothing to help. The momentum of revolution was now unstoppable. The hired party hacks at the front clapped as usual, but the rest of the crowd began to heckle and boo him. Ceausescu was baffled, silenced, and lost. The crowds who tried to storm the building were held back by the army, which was still siding with Ceausescu. But the banners, which had for so long proclaimed support for his tyranny, would do so no more. Fighting continued throughout the night of December the 21st. The next day, the crowds were celebrating the inevitable end of Ceausescu and Elena. The success of the revolution was guaranteed when the army abandoned the twin dictators and joined the people in overthrowing them. The revolution had triumphed. Ceausescu and Elena fled by helicopter, but as the success of the revolution became known, they were abandoned by the helicopter pilot and all but one of their bodyguards. Fleeing from the mob, the Ceausescus arrived tired and scared in a remote village. With their one remaining bodyguard, they hijacked a car at gunpoint. Its driver was astonished and terrified.
I was so scared that my leg was trembling. I have never felt like that in my whole life. I braked and Ceausescu hit his head on the windscreen because I was driving a bit fast. In order to let me recover, Ceausescu held my leg pressed down on the accelerator with his left hand. And this helped me to drive better. He kept looking at me. You could see that he was very scared and nervous.
As the Ceausescus tried to escape, the rest of the country was watching the revolution unfold on television. By now, the television station had been taken over. plans for the new Romania were being openly debated and broadcast. The program was interrupted to tell the nation of the Ceausescu's flight. Their whereabouts were being transmitted live. As their last journey continued, the hunted pair listened to the news on the car radio. They finally realized that their days in power were over.
Ceausescu's head fell on the dashboard of the car. I also noticed that his grip on my leg loosened. At that time, I thought he had died of fright. After a few moments, he woke up and started shouting, "This is a coup. I've been sold for a handful of dollars." And you could see tears in his face. Ceausescu started crying with big tears and said, "Save me, save me, save me." You could see a lost, scared person.
At last, in desperation, the hijacked driver tricked the Ceausescus into taking refuge in a factory where he did business. The factory workers were drinking and watching coverage of the revolution on television in the director's office. When Nicolae Petrisor appeared and told them that the Ceausescus were sitting outside in his car, they laughed in disbelief, at first. When the police were finally summoned, Nicolae Ceausescu collapsed onto the secretary's chair. For security, Ceausescu and Elena had been driven around in an armored car until a decision about their future was made. As long as they were alive, sniping and killing by their supporters would continue. A trial and a death sentence were arranged to bring the fighting to a halt. But Ceausescu had regained his strength and defiance, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the court. His attitude made it easier for the officials to arrive at their predetermined verdict.
They lost their heads and started to be aggressive. So, from that moment, we couldn't speak about a cold and neutral judgment, and of course, the trial was a flawed one. To their credit, their attitude was dignified and strong. At the same time, Ceausescu and his wife proved to be totally unrealistic. But he had the dignity to defend himself with a lot of daring. They faced death in the same way.
The Ceausescus were found guilty. Even their defense lawyers had asked for the death penalty. Only as they were tied up did they realize that their sentences were to be carried out immediately. For every bullet given to Ceausescu, 10 were fired at Elena. Her reputation did not escape her in death. After execution, the Ceausescus were separated in simple graves in different parts of a Bucharest cemetery. Nicu, the son groomed to be Ceausescu's heir, also died soon afterwards of cirrhosis of the liver. Pastor Torques became a bishop. But in the death of Nicolae Ceausescu, even his opponents recognized the loss of an evil but great and wasted talent.
Ceausescu was a man who knew how to present Romania as a unique country, giving it a reputation which it has had under no other leadership.
He was Romania. In a way, one might say, he copied Hitler's own philosophy of one Führer, one people.
This system in my country was one of the worst possible. And this structure was so well organized that almost everything could be checked, could be controlled.
Nobody dared during those 25 years to criticize him or to deny his power. He was one of the greatest tyrants of history.
Last Christmas, Romanians celebrated the 10th anniversary of the execution. But while many other countries in the former Soviet Union made an abrupt transition to capitalism, Romania decided to try a milder version of communism. The country remains one of the poorest in Europe, with runaway inflation and widespread shortages. Even in the capital of Bucharest, abandoned children live in the underground sewers. Romanians complain that the national leaders are still corrupt, and the best way to grow rich is to get elected to political office. But despite all the problems, no one is nostalgic for Nicolae Ceausescu and his reign of terror.
For the web's best bios, log on to biography.com.